Hey everybody, it's Derek here. Thanks as always for stopping by. So at the beginning of April, I read some really interesting history on the old city, and I want to tell you about this book. All right, friends, so today we're talking about Jerusalem Falls. It was written by John Hosler, and it was subtitled 7 Centuries of War and Peace. It basically starts with the Persian sack in 614 and continues to the end of the Crusades in middle of 13th century. 1244 stands out in my mind. And so anyway, as I've mentioned in many of my Muslim history videos, I am extremely out of my depth with this stuff. But I mean, there's just so much history when we're talking about Islam. And I'll tell you, as I've said before, what this grows out of is I'm trying to challenge my Western bias against the East broadly, the Orientalism, the essentialism that's directed at virtually the entire other half of the world, but especially the Islamic world. And it's been thrown into high relief since, I would say, the post 9/11 era of anti-Islam and anti-Arabism, but especially with the renewed hostilities there in Israel-Palestine. And, no better place to look than Jerusalem itself. And let's just look at the record. Obviously, it's not a consecutive record back to the beginning of Islam, but it's 7 centuries just adjacent to the rise of Islam with the Prophet Muhammad, basically a couple decades after where this book starts off. And then, continuing on with the Crusades and Islamic growth in the region and all the rest of it. Now, unlike the other books that I've been reading on this history, which, seems to present a pretty strong consensus for the view that Islamic history overall, and especially under Ottoman rule, you've seen some of the most sweeping, pluralistic, and surprisingly secular movements and realities take hold. Again, when you're looking at the history of all of the regions that were eventually subsumed under the Ottoman Empire, which is vast, of course. And it's hard to, do the calculus on that, which was more pluralistic, which is very subjective in many ways. But there does seem to be a pretty strong consensus that, as empires go, the Ottomans were certainly not the worst. In fact, the Ottomans and much of Islamic history has defined human rights. Now, as implied by the timeline, this book covers long prior to the rise of the Ottomans, but for my purposes of this video, I'm making statements that are germane to the duration of Islam, which is almost an aggression against our modern sensibility because, the West, especially the United States and Britain, we've defined human rights. We made it up, and it's just not the case. We also hear a lot more religious apologetics that it's the Judeo-Christian tradition that has gifted us so much in terms of first principles and human rights and the formulation thereof. I think while there is certainly a lot of evidence in that direction, it's highly dubious to claim that they are the exception, certainly when you apply to the secular West or when you apply it to its religious underpinnings in Judeo-Christianity. So this book is somewhat different in that regard. Now, it doesn't say Islam was horrible. It doesn't make the counter assertion that Islam was uniquely oppressive. But it says, there's something actually kind of attractive in this book. John Hosler is promoting a view that when you really scratch into most of these conflicts, religion, especially when it involves the old city, religion doesn't figure as the most important issue. Even though, when we think about the Crusades, right, that seems like very counter-narrative when you think about it. Like, the Crusades weren't a religious war. They certainly were a religious war. There's no denying that religion was a very big part of it. But he says when you really scratch into what was underneath it, there was a lot more going on than just the religious fanaticism. I'm certainly not an expert in the area. I'm not well read in the topic. I'm beginning to get some reading under my belt. So this is a learning process with me. You have to be patient with me on this particular point of view because I'm coming in pretty ignorant. But I'm just presenting to you what he says in the book. And with that, I would like to read you an excerpt which he's speaking specifically about the events of 1099, but throughout the book, you get a sense this is the tone that he takes towards that entire period and the conflicts that arose specifically within the Old City, how there's a lot more going on there than just the religious component, which has been broadcast the most. So let me read this to you. For too long, the shadow of its bloody massacre has skewed understanding of the longer duration of Jerusalem's history. By focusing overmuch on the events of 1099, and I would add the whole era that this book covers, which were the exception to the rule, we have crafted memories of the past in an illogical, emotionally driven, and context-free manner. We can do better by directing our ire from a different perspective. It was awful not only because it was an immoral act, but because it undid centuries of interfaith accord that had begun with the rise of Islam. So that part of it does hold to the consensus that Islam certainly wasn't worse than the rest of them. You actually had quite a lot of interfaith there, a lot of ecumenism. It goes on. Such details matter when dealing with the horrendous events of 1099. Wielding massacre as a bludgeon has been a popular means of condemning past actors, religions, and cultures and their present beneficiaries, or advancing preferred political and social objectives. Boy, how true is that? There is a better argument, which is ecumenical, not moral. It drops the accusatory style in favor of the sensibility of lamentation. The 1099 massacre was a sad and regrettable thing, not simply for the people involved, but also for the pluralism it impeded, to everyone's detriment. The emphasis on the killing obscures the greater lessons of what was lost. A 5-century stretch of accord between competing faith traditions in the most sensitive of places. Those looking for historical ammunition for their partisan positions have preferred, and surely will continue, to repeat the body count. That this view has resonated so strongly, however, only means that we have chosen to privilege it over other interpretative possibilities. An alternate focus on what the Near East lost that year and how it might possibly be regained holds greater potential for resolving differences, but has not really been tried. It is always easier to use history to denounce the other, but the effect is to remain stuck in neutral, looking through the regrettable clash of civilizations lens. So I appreciated that level of nuance. So I think this book represents an important piece when we're looking at, well, specifically Jerusalem, but when we're also looking at the interfaith realities on the ground that have existed throughout history. And especially when you look at the region now, with all of the hostility going on. Even in my young adulthood, when I started to look into this conflict between Israel and Palestine, I thought, like everybody else, that, well, it's just a religious conflict between two extremely intolerant competing nationalisms. But there's actually a lot more going on there. It's not the irreconcilability of these religions and these cultures. They have coexisted. There's been so much evidence throughout history to show that there has been a lot of coexistence and pluralism and acceptance of one another between these religions. That's not the ultimate source of this problem. It certainly doesn't help the conflict. I'll say that much. Christopher Hitchens said that, why have we not been able to get a two-state solution? Everybody backs it. The PLO backs it. The international community backs it. Everybody who's done some serious scholarship and reading or human rights work on this backs that as the most viable of options that we can see with our limited human capacity for prescience, if you will. But he says, we all know why we can't get peace. It's because the warring religions in that region have a veto on the peace. I think there's a lot of white-hot internecine heat that you can trace back to the religious underpinnings of some of the worst actors in that region. But I don't think that it is the central problem. I believe the central problem here is much better understood in terms of colonialism and imperialism and the indigenous realities that were there prior to the creation of Israel and continue until this day. So anyway, this has been a very good installment in that direction. I would recommend it. I rated it 3 stars only because I felt really out of my depth, but I did enjoy it. But if you have an interest, well, specifically in the history of the Old City, but I would also say, the rise of Islam and also the Crusades, this would be very interesting to you. With that, I'd like to leave it there for today, but I would love to hear from you guys in the comments what you make of what I said, and perhaps if you have some reading along the same lines that you would recommend. Thanks for stopping by. We'll see you in the next one.
Hey everyone, I hope you liked this video. If you want more like the one you just watched, click the suggested video on this screen. Make sure you subscribe, and to connect with me on my other platforms, my handles are linked below in the description, alright? Take care, peeps. Till next time.